One question. That's all it took to unravel everything. Senator Chris Van Hollen leaned forward across the table, locked eyes with Attorney General Pam Bondi, and asked something so simple it should have taken 2 seconds to answer. Will you comply with the budget authorization law? The room went quiet. What happened next wasn't just awkward, it was revealing. Because instead of a clean yes or no, Bondi launched into this winding explanation about umbrellas and efficiency and collaboration. And right then, everyone watching realized something bigger was happening. This wasn't about spreadsheets or government paperwork. This was about power and who gets to control it.
Umbrella, doing away with the bureaucracy at the top. These agents are going, they want to be out hunting down criminals. That's what they want to do. They work, so much of this work is the same work going back and forth. And now they will be working collaboratively together to keep America safe. And we're going to put hundreds of agents back, thousands back on the streets, and that's where they want to be. And I would have had the initial concerns that you have about that, but give us a chance, let it work, let the DEA and ATF work together, get those agents out there, do away with the bureaucracy, and hopefully we will make America safer as a result of it.
Well, I will say that wasn't just my reaction to the proposal. I was actually hearing from ATF agents as well. So again, we will obviously review that question on a bipartisan way on the committee. But I just wanted your assurance, and I appreciate it, that you'll comply with the appropriations law, which would require congressional action in order to go forward with
We don't need congressional action for this move, however.
Well, I thought I just got clarification. Well, it's going to be important to both the chairman and myself to understand your position as Attorney General on whether or not you can proceed with this merger without congressional action.
We are keeping ATF, we are keeping DEA. We are putting them under the same umbrella within the Department of Justice.
So I'm not arguing with you here. I want to understand your position. I think it will be important to members on both sides of the committee. The appropriations law currently would require that Congress approve of this merger. And so my question to you as Attorney General is, do you agree with that or disagree with it?
We will complete this reorganization, and I'm committed. I will look at that under the law. We will not violate the law, Senator, and we will work with Congress regarding that.
No, I appreciate that. So the second point I wanted to raise had to do with the prosecution of hate crimes, and I share your vigor in wanting to go after and prosecute hate crimes. I would just point out that the budget that you submitted zeroes out funding for 3 of the DOJ hate crimes programs. The hate crimes training program, Shepard Burt hate crimes, the Jabara Hire No Hate Act, and the community approaches to advancing justice. So I hope you'll work with the committee if we seek to restore funding for those programs.
Yes, Senator, I just pulled up the details of those 3. Let me see. I'd be happy to discuss those with you further.
Good. And finally, I want to go back.
All 3 of those.
Thank you. I want to go back to the issues of grant determinations, because I think there continues to be some confusion between grants that had already been obligated that were withheld. And to my knowledge, there are about 400 of those still pending. It'd be helpful to get from your team if you have a different number. And then there's what we call notices for information, which relates to notices for future grant awards in this current fiscal year.
Yes, there is a difference.
And so I understood your earlier testimony to say, with respect to the notices, you, the department, plan to issue those very shortly. Is that right?
Yeah, and Senator, yes, you are correct on that. We notified the affected grantees and members of Congress regarding the terminations and how to appeal. That was the $811 million of grants that were initially terminated in 2025. We're also talking about upcoming ones as well.
Right. So I want to leave this hearing with some clarity on this issue. So when it comes to the notices of funding opportunities, because the clock is ticking on this
It
fiscal
is.
year, do you and the Department of Justice intend to quickly notify people of those opportunities going?
Yes, Senator Van Hollen, as I said earlier, and it will be done on a rolling basis. But yes, within the coming weeks, we are absolutely doing that. Yes,
And so finally,
but on a rolling basis.
on the other category, which are the grants that had been previously obligated, I do have concerns, Madam Attorney General, with the idea that the way we're going to get them to stop being withheld is members of Congress calling. I appreciate the invitation, and I will look to see if we've been hearing from people. But this category of grants relates to people who already went through the process and already had those grants obligated, and they're currently being held.
Mm-hmm.
So my question to you is, can you tell us how many are still being held today? And I don't like the idea that in order for somebody to get their withheld grant, unheld, that they have to call a member of Congress. That should be so. How many are left? How many of these grants are?
I don't know exactly, Senator, but I know many of them are the subject of ongoing litigation. So I wouldn't be able to speak of that in detail in this forum anyway.
Well, maybe just a follow up, because it would be helpful to try to narrow the scope of this. Again, my understanding, and this was the subject of the letter I referenced earlier from a number of senators.
And I have not read that letter, but I will be happy to read that letter.
If you and your team could get back to us right away on that, because these are grants that, as the chairman knows, have been previously obligated, some many years ago, but frozen. And so the question is, how can we get them unfrozen? And I don't, members of Congress will call, but not everybody,
Bondi walked into that hearing room ready to sell her plan. She wanted to merge two of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in America, the ATF and the DEA, and she had her talking points locked and loaded. Cut the red tape. Get agents out of offices and back on the streets. Make America safer through streamlined operations. It sounded reasonable enough on the surface. Bureaucracy bad, efficiency good. Simple narrative. But Van Hollen wasn't buying the sales pitch. He wanted specifics. He wanted to know if this whole reorganization was even legal without Congress signing off. And that's when things started falling apart. Bondi tried explaining how the merger would work. One umbrella, she kept saying. Put both agencies under one umbrella inside the Department of Justice. Agents don't want to be stuck doing paperwork. They want to be hunting criminals. The work overlaps anyway, so why not combine resources? She painted this picture of thousands of federal agents being freed from bureaucratic chains, flooding back onto American streets to fight crime. It was a compelling vision, except it dodged the actual question Van Hollen asked, because none of that efficiency talk mattered if the move itself violated federal law. And Van Hollen knew it. He pressed again. Politely, but firmly. I appreciate your explanation, but I need your assurance you'll comply with appropriations law, which requires congressional action for this kind of merger. Watch what happened next. Bondi's response shifted. Suddenly, it wasn't about working with Congress anymore. We don't need congressional action for this move, she said. Just like that. The careful political language dropped for a second, and the real position came out. The Department of Justice believed it could reorganize two major federal agencies without asking permission from the people's representatives. Van Hollen caught it immediately. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He just calmly pointed out that he needed to understand her position clearly, because members on both sides of the committee would want to know if the Attorney General thought she could bypass Congress entirely. That's when Bondi tried to walk it back. Sort of. She pivoted to this carefully constructed middle ground that didn't actually answer anything. I mean, we're keeping ATF, we're keeping DEA, we're just putting them under the same umbrella within DOJ. As if calling it an umbrella instead of a merger changed the legal requirements. Van Hollen wasn't letting it slide. He laid it out plain. The appropriations law currently on the books requires Congress to approve this kind of reorganization. So the question isn't about efficiency or agent deployment. The question is, does the Attorney General agree that law applies here, or does she think the DOJ can ignore it? Bondi's final answer was probably the most telling of the entire exchange. We will complete this reorganization, and I'm committed to looking at that under the law. We will not violate the law, Senator. Notice what she did there. She committed to completing the reorganization first, then said she'd look at the law, not the other way around. It's like saying you're definitely moving forward. But don't worry, you'll check if it's legal while you're already doing it. The constitutional problem here isn't complicated. Congress controls the money. That's not a courtesy or tradition. It's written into the foundation of American government. The executive branch, which includes the Department of Justice, can't just shuffle major agencies around and reallocate billions in funding because it feels more efficient. The founders specifically designed the system this way to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral action. When Bondi said they don't need congressional action, she wasn't just making a policy statement. She was claiming authority the Constitution doesn't give her. And Van Hollen knew if he let that statement sit unchallenged, it would become the new normal. Today, it's merging ATF and DEA. Tomorrow, it's something bigger. The precedent matters more than the specific agencies involved, but Van Hollen wasn't done. He shifted gears completely, moving to something that seemed unrelated but actually fit the same pattern. He brought up hate crimes. Specifically, he pointed out that Bondi's proposed budget had zeroed out funding for 3 Department of Justice programs designed to combat hate crimes. The Shepherd Bird Hate Crimes Program, the Jabara Hire No Hate Act, Community Approaches to Advancing Justice. These aren't symbolic programs. They fund training for local law enforcement on how to identify and investigate hate crimes. They support data collection, so we actually know what's happening across the country. They help communities develop prevention strategies before violence erupts. And Bondi's budget deleted all of them. The timing made it worse. Hate crimes have been spiking nationwide over the last several years. Attacks on religious minorities, racial violence, targeted harassment, it's all trending upward according to FBI statistics. So the moment when you'd expect the Department of Justice to double down on prevention and prosecution, the proposed budget eliminates the programs designed to do exactly that. Van Hollen didn't accuse Bondi of anything. He just noted the cuts and said he hoped she'd work with the committee if they sought to restore funding. Her response was basically, "Let me look at those and get back to you," which might sound reasonable, except she's the Attorney General. These are Department of Justice programs. She should know why they're being cut before submitting a budget that cuts them. The pattern was forming. On the merger, Bondi couldn't give a straight answer about following the law. On hate crimes funding, she couldn't explain why critical programs were being eliminated. And then came the third issue, which might have been the most damaging of all, the frozen grants. Van Hollen brought up something that had been quietly causing chaos for months. The Department of Justice had withheld hundreds of federal grants that were already approved and obligated. We're not talking about applications under review or future funding decisions. These were grants that had gone through the entire approval process, been signed off on, and were legally obligated. Money that communities, police departments, and justice organizations were counting on, and it just stopped flowing. Van Hollen wanted to know how many grants were still frozen. Seems like a basic question. If you're the Attorney General overseeing the department that controls these funds, you should be able to say, "We're holding 247 grants," or whatever the number is. Bondi couldn't do it. "I don't know exactly, Senator." She followed up by saying, "Many of them are subject to ongoing litigation, which is why she couldn't discuss details." But that answer created more questions than it solved. Because if grants are being held due to litigation, there should be a clear list. Legal disputes don't just happen in a vacuum. There are case numbers, court filings, specific issues being contested. The fact that the Attorney General couldn't specify how many grants fell into this category suggested either the department didn't have a handle on its own actions, or they were being deliberately vague. The dollar amounts involved weren't small either. Van Hollen mentioned that initially, $801 million in grants were terminated in 2025. Some had been released after appeals, but hundreds remained frozen. And here's where it got really ugly. Van Hollen pointed out that some organizations only got their frozen grants released after calling members of Congress to intervene. Think about what that means. Federal money that was legally approved, that communities desperately needed, sitting locked up until someone with political connections made a phone call to unlock it. Bondi tried to soften this by saying citizens could call directly too, not just through Congress. But that doesn't fix the fundamental problem. In a system that's supposed to work on rules and processes, why is there a need for phone calls at all? If a grant is approved and obligated, the money should flow automatically. The fact that it doesn't, and that getting it requires personal intervention, means the system is broken. Van Hollen made this point crystal clear. Not everybody can just call their senator. It's obvious, but it needed to be said, because what Bondi was describing, whether she realized it or not, was a two-tiered system. People with access and connections can get their grants unfrozen. Everyone else waits indefinitely or gives up entirely. That's not how federal funding is supposed to work. It's not how any legitimate government process should work. And the fact that this was happening under the Department of Justice, the agency responsible for ensuring equal application of law, made it even more troubling. What made this hearing so significant wasn't any single answer Bondi gave. It was the cumulative weight of all the non-answers. When asked about congressional authority over the merger, she gave contradictory statements. When asked about hate crimes funding cuts, she said she'd look into it. When asked about frozen grants, she couldn't provide numbers. Each evasion by itself might seem like typical political hedging, But together, they painted a picture of an attorney general either unwilling or unable to be transparent about major decisions happening inside her department. And transparency isn't optional in government. It's the only thing that keeps power in check. The merger issue keeps circling back because it exposes something fundamental. Bondi kept framing this as an efficiency move. Less bureaucracy, more agents on the street, better coordination between agencies. All of that might be true. But efficiency doesn't override legal process. If the law says Congress has to approve major reorganizations, then Congress has to approve them. It doesn't matter if the Attorney General thinks it's a good idea. It doesn't matter if it would save money or improve operations. The Constitution gives the legislative branch control over how agencies are structured and funded, specifically to prevent the executive branch from accumulating too much unilateral power. When Bondi said, "We don't need congressional action," she wasn't just wrong about the law. She was challenging a fundamental principle of American government. This is how institutional boundaries erode. Not through dramatic confrontations or public crises, but through small incremental moves that test how much oversight can be avoided. You start with a merger that sounds reasonable. You frame it as efficiency and public safety. You move forward before getting approval, promising to check the legal requirements later. And if nobody stops you, the precedent is set. Next time, the executive action gets a little bigger. The legal justification gets a little thinner. And slowly, the balance of power shifts away from elected representatives and toward appointed officials operating behind closed doors. Van Hollen understood this. That's why he kept pressing for clarity. Not because he opposed the merger on principle, but because the process matters. He even said explicitly that he had concerns after hearing from ATF agents, meaning there was legitimate disagreement about whether this merger was even good policy. But he separated that debate from the legal question. Even if everyone agreed the merger was brilliant, it still requires congressional approval. That's not a bug in the system. It's the core feature that makes democratic oversight possible. The hate crimes funding cuts fit the same pattern. These programs exist because Congress authorized them and allocated money for them. An attorney general can't just decide they're not priorities anymore and zero them out. That's Congress's decision to make. If Bondi thinks those resources should go elsewhere, she can make that case to Congress and ask them to reallocate the funding. But eliminating programs unilaterally, especially programs designed to combat violence that's actively increasing, is an efficiency. It's overreach. And the fact that Bondi didn't seem to understand why this was a problem suggested she didn't see congressional oversight as a real constraint on her authority. The frozen grants might be the clearest example of dysfunction. These aren't discretionary decisions where the Attorney General has legitimate authority to make judgment calls. These are legally obligated funds. Once a grant goes through the approval process and gets obligated, the department has a legal duty to release that money. Holding it back isn't a policy choice. It's a violation of the obligation. The only legitimate reason to withhold obligated funds is if there's evidence of fraud or legal violations by the recipient. And even then, there are specific procedures that have to be followed. You can't just freeze everything and sort it out later while communities suffer. Bondi mentioned ongoing litigation as the reason many grants remained frozen. But litigation over federal grants usually involves disputes about eligibility or compliance, not blanket holds on hundreds of grants simultaneously. If there were really legal issues with that many grants, it would represent a massive systemic failure in the approval process. More likely, the litigation she referenced was from organizations suing the department for wrongfully withholding their funds, which means the frozen grants aren't the result of legal problems with recipients. They're the result of the Department of Justice choosing to hold money it's legally required to release. This creates real harm. A police department waiting on a grant to upgrade equipment operates with outdated tools. A community organization that budgeted around expected funding has to cut programs or lay off staff. Victim services that depend on federal support leave people without help. These aren't abstract bureaucratic delays. They're concrete failures that affect real people dealing with real problems. And when the only way to unlock that funding is knowing which politician to call, it makes the entire system feel rigged. Because it is rigged, not by design, but by an executive agency that decided it could ignore its legal obligations and face no consequences. Van Hollen's questioning throughout the hearing followed a deliberate strategy. He didn't grandstand or deliver speeches. He asked specific, factual questions that required clear answers. Will you comply with the law? Why were these programs cut? How many grants are still frozen? Each question was designed to put Bondi on record with an unambiguous position. And each time she found a way to avoid giving one. That avoidance is the story. Because in a functioning system with real oversight, officials can't just dodge accountability. They have to explain their decisions, justify their authority, and accept constraints on their power. When they don't, it means oversight has failed. The broader implications reach beyond this specific hearing. What happens when the Department of Justice operates like it's above congressional oversight? What happens when obligated funds become negotiable based on political considerations? What happens when programs combating violence get eliminated without explanation? You get an executive branch that sees itself as autonomous, answering to no one except maybe the president. And even that's questionable. Because in large bureaucracies, cabinet officials often operate with significant independence once they're confirmed. This is the quiet crisis in American government. Not a dramatic constitutional clash, but a slow accumulation of unchecked decisions. An agency reorganization here, a funding cut there, some frozen grants that eventually get resolved through back channels. None of it seems catastrophic in the moment, but it adds up. It normalizes executive power operating outside traditional constraints. It teaches future officials that oversight is optional as long as you're willing to be vague and noncommittal when questioned. And it tells the public that the rules don't really matter as long as you can justify your actions with appeals to efficiency or safety. Van Hollen's final comments in the exchange were telling. He asked Bondi's team to get back to the committee right away with information about the frozen grants. It sounded routine, almost boring, but it was actually a test. Because if the Department of Justice responds promptly with complete information, it suggests they're willing to be transparent and work within oversight structures. If they delay, provide incomplete data, or claim they can't share details due to litigation or other excuses, it confirms they're operating outside normal accountability. Either way, the response tells you everything you need to know about whether this administration sees Congress as a co-equal branch or an obstacle to be managed. The constitutional design is elegant in its simplicity. Congress makes laws and controls money. The executive branch enforces laws and spends money according to congressional authorization. Courts settle disputes about whether laws are being followed. Each branch has defined powers and clear limitations. The system only works if everyone respects those boundaries. When an attorney general claims authority to reorganize agencies without approval, eliminate programs without justification, and withhold obligated funds without accountability, those boundaries disappear. And once they're gone, getting them back requires confrontation that most politicians would rather avoid. That's what made this hearing matter. Van Hollen didn't avoid the confrontation. He asked the uncomfortable questions that expose overreach. He insisted on clarity when Bondi offered vagueness. He drew attention to decisions being made in the shadows, forcing them into public record. That's how oversight is supposed to function. Not through dramatic showdowns, but through persistent, detailed questioning that makes it impossible for officials to hide behind bureaucratic language. Every time a senator forces a cabinet official to answer directly, even if the answer is evasive, it creates a record. And that record becomes evidence if the situation escalates. The ATF and DEA merger will likely move forward in some form. The hate crimes programs might get restored by Congress, or they might not. The frozen grants will eventually get resolved, either through litigation or political pressure. But the precedent being set here extends beyond any specific policy outcome. It's about whether executive agencies have to explain themselves, justify their authority, and accept oversight as a condition of their power. Bondi's performance in this hearing suggested she sees oversight as an annoyance rather than a requirement. In that perspective, if it becomes the norm across government, fundamentally changes how American democracy functions. The question Van Hollen asked at the start still hangs in the air. Will you comply with the budget authorization law? Bondi never really answered it. She said she wouldn't violate the law while also claiming she didn't need congressional authorization. She promised to look at the legal requirements while also committing to complete the reorganization. Those positions can't coexist. Either the law requires congressional approval or it doesn't. Either the DOJ will wait for that approval or it won't. The contradiction isn't an accident. It's a strategy. By refusing to take a clear position, Bondi keeps all options open. She can move forward with the merger, and if Congress objects, claim she was still reviewing the legal questions. She can claim she's respecting oversight while ignoring its constraints. And unless someone forces the issue, she'll probably get away with it. That's the real scandal here. Not the merger itself, not even the frozen grants or cut programs. The scandal is an attorney general who believes transparency and accountability are optional, who thinks she can dodge direct questions about her legal authority and face no consequences, who runs a department that can't even say how many grants it's wrongfully withholding. The substance of each issue matters, but the pattern matters more. Because if the highest law enforcement official in the country doesn't think she has to follow the rules about oversight and authorization, why would anyone else in government? This is how institutions fail. Not through collapse, but through erosion. One unanswered question at a time. One reorganization that bypasses approval. One budget that eliminates programs without explanation. One set of grants frozen indefinitely while communities wait. Each decision sets the stage for the next one. Each boundary crossed makes the next boundary easier to ignore. And eventually, you wake up in a system where oversight exists on paper but not in practice, where officials make promises they don't keep, and where citizens have no real way to hold power accountable. Van Hollen's questioning was a reminder that it doesn't have to be that way, that senators can still demand answers, expose contradictions, and force uncomfortable truths into the public record. Whether that questioning leads to actual accountability depends on what happens next. Will Congress follow up? Will they use their budget authority to block the merger until the legal questions are resolved? Will they restore the hate crimes funding? Will they investigate the frozen grants and hold officials responsible for violating legal obligations? Or will this hearing become just another moment of temporary discomfort that everyone forgets once the news cycle moves on? The answer to those questions will define not just this administration, but the trajectory of executive power for years to come. Because every time Congress lets overreach slide, it becomes harder to stop the next instance. Every time an official dodges accountability without consequences, other officials learn they can do the same. The system is self-reinforcing, either toward greater oversight or toward less. Right now, based on this hearing, it's moving toward less. And that should concern anyone who thinks democratic institutions matter. One question exposed all of this. Will you comply with the budget authorization law? 20 minutes of careful questioning revealed an attorney general who either doesn't understand her legal constraints or doesn't care about them, who sees efficiency as justification for bypassing Congress, who eliminates programs without explanation and freezes funds without accountability. The facts are on the record now. What matters is whether anyone does anything about them. Because accountability isn't automatic. It requires people in positions of power to actually exercise oversight, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it creates conflict, even when it would be easier to look the other way. Van Hollen did his part. Now we'll see if anyone else follows through, or if this moment just becomes another example of how easily the system bends when nobody bothers to defend it.